welcome to another episode of the Retail Perch. And here we are back again talking about technology and trends in the grocery retail sector. And last episode, we talked about why personalization, why is it important? And we talked a little bit about the history with Gary, our co-host. Gary's obviously had many years of experience running his own supermarket. So I want to do a quick recap on what we talked about in terms of personalization and how it is relevant to the supermarket industry. So Gary, just picking up from our conversation previously in the previous episode, tell us a little bit about, in your capacity as a retailer, how did you go about, what was the process that you undertook, which was like 10, 15 years ago, but a lot of the technologies that exist today didn't exist back then. What was your approach?
Yeah, and sort of frightening to say here, but it's really been almost 30 years now since I launched that original loyalty program, right? But it really, our approach really evolved as we went along. It began with a best customer focus, right? So at a very high level, understanding, that approximately 30% of shoppers generated around 80% of total sales volume over a year. So we simply began to focus on those folks and providing them periodically incremental savings just for them on certain products. There was no personalization involved because, quite honestly, at the time, the technology didn't allow us or enable us to do that. So we would just take popular items around the store, maybe milk or Coca-Cola, or whatever, and mail those best customers a coupon, paper coupon that they'd have to bring into the store to scan to get those savings. The next iteration of that, and it was tied to our deploying a new POS system that supported pricing by customer segment. So we, began to evolve towards, think of it as sort of customer category management, I think we had 7 segments of shoppers, new, lapsed, and then, gold, silver, bronze, whatever we were calling them. So we began to do pricing by those segments. So we would extend maybe a, really low price or very aggressive price to gold customers that they could get electronically when they shopped and identified themselves. We worked with that for a while until the first engine that supported personalization right through how we begin to think of it today, algorithm-driven personalization. And I'm going back probably 15 years or so ago when we began doing that. And it was, again, not for all shoppers because we were bearing the cost of all those discounts for the most part. We'd put together an offer pool of maybe couple hundred items and, run it through this engine for the top, 10%, 20% of shoppers. And that's really where we stayed for quite some time. Yeah, even that was way ahead of what many others were doing at that time. So that's sort of the history of the evolution. But I think, as we step back and look what's happening now, we look at what not only data is available, but what technology is enabling us to do. I'd sort of flip the question back to you because you're the technology guy.
Yeah, so before you ask me that question, Gary, one important question, which is, what was the cost to you to do this? I mean, what did you have to do internally within the organization? Was there an investment? Was it acquiring technology, people? What was it?
So it was a good question, and it was all the above, right? So, I had effectively a full-time person focused on this. So resource-wise, yes, we had acquired and were using several different technologies from, some of our listeners may remember the old Market Technics, Market Expert system that was, really the first database system for grocery retailers. We used that, and then we used some of these other pieces that were from real young startup companies to do this targeting and so on. Much of it was in the early times communicated via direct mail. But going back 15 years or so ago, when we rolled out what we called Smart Shop at the time, we were using email, we were using the web, and at that time, we we're also using kiosks in the store, where a shopper could simply walk in the door, put their finger down. We were using biometrics to ID the customer, and within a couple seconds, it would kick out sort of their personalized shopping list of savings.
Got it. Cool. This is cool stuff. This is 15 years ago, right?
This is 15 years ago. Wow, gosh, 17 years ago now. Yeah.
Wow. That's amazing. All right. So moving on, Gary, you were gonna ask a question.
Yeah. So I think that not only all the data that's available today, but the available technologies today. AI, machine learning. All these really powerful tools enable a whole different approach to this. And so, I'd flip the question back to you, Shaker, as the technology expert here. How are you seeing these new technologies helping retailers? What are some of the problems, Bird's Eye has helped retailers solve when it comes to all this data, driving insights, and taking action?
No, great question, Gary. I think one of the things, that's obviously changed in the world in the last 12, 13 years is cloud, right? So previously, if you, in your IT departments, you had to buy actual physical hardware, set them up in your data center, and that implied you were limited with your processing capacity, right? There was only so much you could do. If you needed to have another database with additional information, that the machine had to be sized, acquired. You needed to have somebody who comes in and install it, administers these systems. So there were these incredible costs that were associated with scaling operations.
Yeah.
But what the cloud has really done is given infinite elasticity to compute and storage requirements. And that kind of changed the whole game. So, and I'm sure a lot of our listeners who are retailers, they may or may not be on the cloud. They're probably still operating out of a little data center that they have in their premises. And but one of the things that the cloud does is it reduces costs, it increases scalability, increases elasticity, and actually prevents you from, it helps you from recovering faster, because now you're not physically located at a location, so you kind of spread out, right? So
Yeah.
there's all these additional technological advances that have happened in the last decade or so, which have completely changed the game on what you can do with the data, right? So the data was always there. The problem was, how do you get the appropriate infrastructure and size machine? So it was inconceivable. It was a non-starter, because some of these problems that we're trying to solve, Gary, require a huge amount of space.
Right.
And then every time you say, hey, I want to try something out new, now to go acquire another machine or add some storage, there were all costs and time delays involved. So you didn't have the ability to experiment at the speed that you wanted to. You couldn't visualize data at the speed that you wanted to. Everything had to be kind of pre-planned, take months to execute before you saw the results. So that fundamentally has changed the game.
So would it be fair to say that before the cloud, that the accessibility to this kind of technology was really limited to the very biggest companies that could afford all this stuff, the data centers, all the boxes, all the analysts to crunch through data, et cetera. And the cloud has really made this more accessible to more retailers, even smaller retailers.
Yeah, I mean, the word I would use is democratized, right? It's democratized access to, high performance computing, large data sets, and the like. So I think that's the first thing that is fundamentally changed, right? The second thing is, of course, I think, larger companies tend to have more resources in terms of people who have the expertise to work on this data, right? Whether it's analytics or AI or machine learning, whatever it is that you want to do with the data. And I think that has also shifted, because there's a more decentralized approach now. There's a bunch of startups that are able to provide services that you can partner with. And the turnaround time from going from data to getting some insights is shrinking, right? It's rapidly shrinking. Maybe it used to be months, and now it's down to weeks, and soon down to days, and maybe down to hours in the near future, and minutes, right? So I think that's the next second big shift, is that there are now actually companies that you can partner up with that can give you access to those insights and capabilities. You don't have to necessarily have the talent in-house. And frankly,
Right.
Gary, if you are a AI machine learning expert or big data expert coming out of an institution, the first thought is not to go join a supermarket retail company as your first job.
That,
It's a great industry to work in, but I think the perception is that I want to go work in a tech company, right?
right.
And so that poses an interesting challenge to a lot of retailers out there who are looking to get into the space where they want to leverage these new technologies. Is how do you even do it? Yes, I know it's out there, but I need a resource and talent in-house to do it. And so I think that's been solved to some degree. There's lots of solution providers out there that you can partner with. And I think one of the concerns that people have is, okay, it's my data, it's customer identified data. I mean, this is my treasure, right? And
Yeah.
there's plenty of things that secure that data, that can mask all the fields that you don't want to expose. And there's lots of protection you can put around it, so that the data is still owned by you, but you're essentially licensing it to a provider to provide these insights. So I think those two things suddenly unlock possibilities.
Yeah, and no, I think those are really great comments. I've talked to a couple of top 10 supermarket retailers just over the last month or two, and they shared with me that when it comes to IT and developers, they're competing because everyone works remotely today. They're competing with the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples of the world for top tier talent, and they simply can't afford to pay what these big tech companies can. So you're absolutely right.
Right. So I think one thing is, is it even possible to do it? If it's possible to do it, can I get the people who can do it? And the third is, what do I want to do? Right.
Yes.
So and I think and how do I then go about doing it? So I think the what do you want to do? I think, Gary, you kind of answered it really well, which is your goal is to start thinking about personalization not as this cool shiny tool that people need to get, but you need to think about it as a strategy to go to market, which is, I really need to get to know my customers. And I think we've talked about this several times in our episodes, where if you look at the history of grocery, it was really that corner store where the store owner knew everybody by name, knew you intimately enough to have a conversation or a relationship. And I think when you think about what do I want to do, given that these capabilities exist, is you want to somehow revive that one-on-one relationship with the customer, right? Yeah. And while it's not physically possible to do it, it is possible to do it through data, right? Yes. And the engagement touch points that we have today. And so the question is, how do I go about building that relationship with the customer, if that's my goal, using the capabilities that I have today? And then we can get into the hows of how you go about doing it.
Yeah, and just to reinforce that, I believe this for a long time, but certainly today, I think any retailer needs to know their customers, right? If not individually, by name and what they're purchasing, they need to have that customer intelligence. They need to understand how well they're retaining shoppers, what the mix of their customer base looks like in terms of higher spending versus lower spending shoppers. They need to understand all of that and incorporate that into how they manage and run their company, right. Especially today, right? And then, yes, it's going further. And then, okay, how can I use some of these latest technologies and tools to develop that relationship, as you were just speaking to, but do it at scale and do it in a really meaningful, relevant way?
Correct. And I think the other thing to think about, while these capabilities exist, I think the legacy method of operating these retail stores they're obviously not, they weren't tailored for the big data world or the cloud world.
Right.
So, the data standards that have been adopted are very much operationally focused, and they're not, big data insight focused, right? From a perspective of, I just need to get this customer checked out as quickly as I can. I really don't care how the words are abbreviated on the receipt. I need to get paid and get to the next customer. So I think that's from a implementation perspective, that's a challenge that we've talked about many times on our episodes on the retail perch, is standardization of the stuff. But I would, I think one of the first things that retailers want to start doing is start thinking about, hey, how do I get prepared to make sure I take advantage of the cloud, all these cool technologies, these solution providers that are out there? How do I make it work for me? And, as a retailer, that's one of the things that you can do, is you can start thinking about, hey, I need to, at the very least, get some of my data in order, clean up my house, get my data in order, right? Second is, if you don't have any kind of loyalty program, which gets you customer identified data, it's not that I think a loyalty program is essential and a must to get this. There are lots of e-commerce websites out there that don't have loyalty data, but because of the fact that you're identifying yourself individually when you purchase, they have data on your purchase history. Right?
Yep.
So, and I think that's how you want to think about it. I just need to have customer identified transactions, right? And it doesn't, and I think most people tend to equate that with loyalty. And I think you want to maybe separate those two concepts, right, Gary?
I completely agree with you, right? I've said for many years that, loyalty is really about data and about information. The goal should be, how do I gain that data? How do I gain that intelligence on a majority of my shoppers and, sales and transactions? I don't care how you do it, right? A loyalty program has historically been the way to achieve that. But in today's world, as you just called out, every time someone shops online, you've got all that by default. Increasingly, there's other ways to identify that shopper and begin to collect and gain all that data. So I think retailers today, thinking about this, need to not just have themselves locked into it's either a loyalty program or nothing. They need to consider the full scope of how they can do this.
Yeah, and frankly, I was listening to some podcasts myself the other day, and one of the things they were talking about is that a really effective loyalty program is where the customer is actually willing to pay to be part of the program, then you have to pay to keep them on, right?
Yeah. And, look at Amazon Prime. Look at what's out there.
Exactly. So I think, that's something that we would encourage retailers to do, is think about personalization separate from loyalty. Loyalty is a way of getting customer identified data. And your program to identify customers could be as simple as doing something interesting with the data and giving it back to the customer and saying, hey, here's what you've been spending on. You want to keep track of your spending, we can provide you receipts and whatever it is, additional value that you can drive that doesn't have to tie with reduction of price of the shelf.
Right. Yes.
And so I think that's step 2, is make sure you have customer identified data. And I think once you have that basic mix, then I think you've got something really incredible, because then you essentially have, a bunch of Lego bricks in your hand that you can put together any which way you want. So think about it. If you don't have customer identified data, it's like saying, hey, here's a Lego design, but I'm not going to give you the Lego bricks to go build it, right?
Right.
So it becomes a building block to designing whatever it is. And it's not like one size fits all. Everybody has a unique approach to how they want to go to market, how they want to provide value to their customers. But think of it exactly like a bunch of Lego bricks. You can build anything you want once you have the basics in your hand. Right?
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right.
Right. So I think the how about it, so what does it do? What does a typical platform do is it really tries to give you insights into individual customer behavior, right? So you're pulling all this data, and typically, these systems will require things like T-logs, which customer identified tags, whether it's some masked phone number or loyalty card number,
Yep.
some unique identifier which says this is a unique customer, right? Some pricing file, your item file, your category hierarchy. So like basic information that's required, so that with every transaction that happens, there is some system that's using that information to update the customer's purchase behavior, right?
Right. Yeah.
And I think a very simple example, Gary, for me is, there's a retailer that we shop at, supermarket that we shop at, and we go by pretty much. I've got to say, 80% of my purchases are the same, right?
Yeah.
And but I find that this retailer is probably not using any of that information, because I keep getting promotions for stuff that I never buy that they want to sell me. And this classic, it's a classic case of trying to fit a square peg into a round hole, right?
Yeah.
It's not going to fit because I'm, you know what I mean, right?
Yeah, that there are still way too many retailers that remain, I think of it as being sort of vendor driven, product driven, instead of customer focused, right?
Right.
It's, what does Kellogg's want me to promote this week? Or, Coke's got some deal on, or they're paying me to put it on the front page of the ad, or special display, so I'm going to sell that. Instead of sort of flipping the equation around and saying, hey, I've got these customers, what do I need to provide each of them to get them to shop with me this week?
Right. So what does these shopper profiles or these individual shopper behavior does, and remember, since it's the cloud, you can store an infinite number of parameters for each shopper and really get detailed about different behaviors around brand, preferences, categories, frequency of purchase, all kinds of things. And you can start tailoring individual customer journeys. And that's really where it gets interesting and fun, because these systems can scale to the point there where they can deal with individual customers, send out personalized communications, personalized offers, set prices, which will bring customers into the store. And then and I think the biggest thing, Gary, is that we can start actually measuring the impact. Right?
Yes.
And I think so for so long, marketing has been, I think a lot of, reputation that marketing has gained is people are not able to measure what a campaign does, or it's too vague. It's very difficult to measure. So it's kind of like this, there's something happening, some mumbo jumbo happening, and somehow the sale happens. And I think personalization and some of these technologies, because there's measurability involved, you can actually see what's the impact of what I'm doing, because you can record every individual customer interaction, so you know if it's effective or not.
Yeah.
Right?
So I think, listening to you, I think the other thing that's happening here is, again, another paradigm shift, right? And it's all enabled by technology today, but practitioners in this area, even around personalization, up until recently, have been sort of living in this world of segmentation. And I know many retailers, you can look at some of the biggest players in the industry, have created dozens, if not hundreds, of different segments of their shoppers, right? And they put those together and understand what brands are important to this segment and so on. But it's still about segment driven, as opposed to truly the individual shopper driven. And I think that's what you're leading to here, and where technology is taking us.
Yeah, completely. And I think I love your analogy with your doubters, dabblers, devotees, and disciples, because I think that's a great analogy in terms of how people see. Ultimately, you're dealing with people, and I think nobody wants to be bucketed in anything just because of some broad characteristics. I think it's useful for you to understand where your business is going, the demographic, the makeup of your customer base. So to understand makeup of your customer base, I think segmentation is obviously, a great way to do it, because you're trying to identify distinguishing characteristics of your customer base. But in terms of relationship and dealing with them and engaging with them, it has to be done on a one-on-one basis, right?
Yes.
And I think that's how I see the difference between segmentation and personalization.
Yeah.
Segmentation is for you to understand your customer base, to see who's coming to your store from a broad characteristic perspective. But when you actually go to market and engage, when I walk into a store, the manager is not saying, okay, you're approximately 5 feet 9 inches, brown, and you got this kind of hair, so I'm going to bucket you.
Right.
He's dealing with me as an individual person. He's not looking at my attributes at that point in time.
Yeah, no, yeah. So you're absolutely right. Those segments, effectively, the way I always thought of it was, they're a scorecard. It's how I keep track of the business, right? How am I doing? But that is differentiated from how I actually go to market and interact with shoppers, right? That's today on a true individual one-to-one basis.
Right.
And it's
correct. And this is born out of the limitation of computing, right? So when you couldn't deal with 1 million customers one by one, it was easier to put them into 4 different buckets and then deal with them as, 4 different entities,
yes.
Right? But we don't have that limitation, but it looks like, some of that thought process is kind of carried on.
Yeah.
But that limitation, that lid is gone. You don't need to think about it. So it can be a segment of 1 now.
Right. But there's still a lot of people out there in the industry that, are very knowledgeable around this area, but they're still, I don't want to say stuck, but, they still have sort of that mindset of how they're viewing this whole space. And it really has evolved and moved on because of the tools that are available now.
Correct. And I think, I think the segment-based approach was obviously the best possible approach given the technology and the limitations that existed 10, 15, 20 years ago, but it's no longer the case. So I think retailers can kind of wake up to the possibility of being able to do this on a one-to-one basis.
Yes. Yeah.
And, the things that you can do with that approach, Gary, are endless. There's just no end to where this rich data and these insights can permeate into your organization, whether it's from marketing automation or in-store experiences, empowering your in-store personnel with data about shoppers to be able to assist them in the store, whether it's wellness driven. I mean, there's just so many ways that this data goes. So I think one thing we want to stress on this episode is that don't think of personalization as this I wish I could type of thing and someday I'll get to it.
Right.
It is like we talked about, it's customer expectation nowadays, right?
Yes.
It's trying to stay ahead of the competition. It's, you don't want it to become a matter of survival. You want to get in the game before and stay ahead of the curve, so to say.
That's right. And I think another dimension to that is, that retailers can't think of this as a more sort of static, almost batch type process. It's got to become, more towards real-time, interactive, evolving, constantly learning type of approach.
Totally, absolutely, right. And I think there's huge things coming out in the future, right? So there's been a lot of talk about, I know we mentioned it on one of our previous episodes, the metaverse, and it's real, right? It's happening. Yes. And it's happening because there's just an incredible amount of focus, and most retailers out there might think, what the heck is the metaverse? Well, you're going to find out about it soon enough. Trust me, there's going to be some documentaries that come out there. But think of it as a way to experience your store in a virtual environment.
Yes.
Right? And there's going to be, and that's digital, right? So we're talking about the next iteration of the web. Right now, the web, you experience the web through your browser, right? You have download a browser and you visit websites and so on and so forth. But soon that experience is going to change. It's going to become where you can put on a headset and then you can literally walk from one store to another virtually and actually enter the store. So if you don't get comfortable with data, if you don't get comfortable with interacting with your customers, these things can become a real challenge for you. And we're not talking about, 30 years from now. We're talking about, 2 to 5 years from now, these experiences are going to come around.
Yeah. And even, augmented reality is here today, right? Yes, for the most part, it's through your smartphone, but it's here. And, what I'm reading, within the next year or so, Apple, Samsung are going to have their next generation of smart glasses. The world is going to become interactive to us.
So I think, it's easy, obviously, listen, we're Gary, you and I mean, we're just sitting here and talking, right? But the people listening to us, they actually have to sign the checkbooks. They have to invest the money, and there's cost and there's time and there's, risk involved with this. So, but I want you guys to think about the flip side of it, which is what happens if you don't
Yes.
go that way, right? Which is, technology is only moving forward. It's going to get more sophisticated, and there's these new methods of interaction that come around. The gap between where you are and where you need to get to catch up just widens. So if you don't get out of the starting blocks now, it just gets more difficult. And all we're trying to say here, Gary, I think, is that it's not that complicated. There's these technologies exist, the solutions that exist, there's providers that'll happily partner with you to get the ball rolling, and you can get started where you are. But I would encourage you guys to think about going down that path and exploring what it is.
Yeah, and I'll even go a step further and say, I don't think retailers have a choice. I think this is what's going on today. This is what's driving competition at, some of the biggest retailers, is this type of intelligence and knowledge about customers. So I don't think retailers really have a choice at the end of the day. And it's not as expensive or as costly as many think. When you look at how retailers have traditionally spent, marketing and advertising, the printed weekly ad and distributing that and so on and so forth, moving into the digital world can actually be more cost effective, much more cost effective than, historical mass marketing. So there's a lot that can be done here.
There's no question about it. And I think you think about cost and effort. If you actually adopt personalization, and in the broad sense that we're talking about, you're talking about actually increasing your margins, right? You're talking about, it's actually, you're losing out on potential increase in margins because you're not adopting this technology. So we just want to ease your fears about adopting this technology, right? And we want to, it's actually not as difficult as people make it out to be. So go out there, explore. If we can be of any help in helping you find a solution, we'll be more than happy to. You can reach us at the retailperch@birdseye.com. We're constantly bringing guests here who are at the forefront of technology, talking about trends and changes. But all of that only makes sense if you are open to moving forward. You got to get out of that fear box and say, I'm going to explore, and it's going to be okay. So, yeah. And Gary, this has been a great conversation. I'm sure there are going to be people out there who find some value. I think your experience, your background, and actually doing it is incredibly helpful here.
Well, and I think it's a good combination of, I can certainly point to, everything I've learned and what other retailers have learned here through the short history of this whole space. But, it's fascinating to understand what technology is enabling retailers to do today. And it's truly exciting. So, no, great conversation. And I'm sure we're going to be continuing.
Yep, absolutely. Well, guys, thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. And as usual, I want to thank Stephanie Doherty for putting this together. And we'll keep this conversation going. More interesting guests coming on down the road. I know 2 episodes with me and Gary. Maybe you're saying that's enough. We need to hear some new voices. But we'll be back with some amazing guests here on the Retail Perch. Again, thank you for listening, and see you next time. Make sure to join us every Monday and connect with us at the Retail Perch on Instagram and Facebook.
And if you have any questions, feel free to email us at theretailperch@birdseye.com.
Until next time, this is Shaker.
And this is Gary, signing off.